Hello and welcome to this special series on risk management leading up to the ICICI Lombard Risk Manager Awards. On the show today, our focus is on risk management in supply chain operations. Supply chain risk management, would all of you agree that it's something that companies and executives should be worrying about more than ever today? I'm going to put this question to you first, Mr. Tiwari.
Yes, I think absolutely they should be. I think especially as a much larger part of Indian companies' sales are exported overseas. So overseas sales become a much bigger part of the average company's P&L. I think managing that risk, understanding that risk, and trying in some way to minimize it is extremely important.
Do you agree? You know, it's number one out there in terms of priorities for executives.
I fully agree. What's happened in the last decade is with globalization, the supply chain has become very complex. So it doesn't restrict yourself to your own suppliers, but the supplier who would be in a different country from your supplier. So with this kind of intricacies, unless you have a risk management system in place along with your supply chain management system, you're running a huge risk.
You know, we say complexity very easily, but Mr. Jain, I'm going to put this to you. I mean, what kinds of new complexities in supply chains are we really talking about here?
No, I think what is happening in our business in the current times is that while our revenues are largely local, but the costs have become global. And the moment we say global, it conjures up an imagination of complexity. And when we say complexity, it is complexity of currency, complexity of culture, communication, commitment and compliance. Like signing an international contract is one, but its administration and fulfillment is a completely another job. So when you deal with organizations which are across the border, I think there is an enormous amount of complexity that has to be dealt with the supply chain people.
You've classified the complexities very neatly. Would you classify the risks also in the same manner, Mr. Jain?
I think it just depends on an organization's vulnerability on each of them. Say, for example, today in India, the vulnerability towards the currency has been absolutely astonishing. Like the erosion of the INR versus the USD in the last few months by almost 15% has actually changed the entire EXIM balance, and organizations are wondering how to deal with that.
Well, you know, that's perfect because I do want each of you to really walk us through what you describe in your organization as complexities in the supply chain. What are the risks that each of you have encountered and what's your response to those risks? How are you managing those risks? So, Mr. Chaturvedi, why don't you go first and walk us through, you know, the kind of complexities that exist in your supply chain?
The way we look at our supply chain is returns management. What we do is that we pick up returns from many of the global OEMs, whether it's an LG or a Samsung or a Whirlpool or Haier, and then what we do is we do repair refurbishment and then we resell it. A lot of our markets, even our customers, are now overseas customers. A lot of the supply that's coming in is also coming from overseas. So if my supplier has an issue with a risk that is happening in China or somewhere in Africa, we get impacted. So what we are trying to do in a very proactive manner is to identify who are our key suppliers, build a better transparent relationship with them so that we don't get hit. See, companies, even when they have huge amount of cash, will get blindsided if they don't look at their entire supply chain transparently and be able to build those relationships and manage to those risks. So we do it every day. We look at our customers. We try to hedge the risks by balancing who our customers are, whether they're in the Middle East or Africa or India. We have to manage for the currency risks, as Mr. Jain pointed out. We have to manage for the parts risks that our OEM can get impacted by. So even though we are a very small company, we are one of, this company is only about 4 years old, but still a global risk management strategy across supply chain is something we've already started to think about.
Same question to you, Mr. Tiwari. Just walk us through step by step, you know, your supply chain, which the most complex areas of it are, what are the risks, how do you address them?
Sure. I'll give you two examples. One is we obviously help a lot of our customers export their products from North India through Nhava Sheva, through Pipavav, through Mundra to European and American markets. a big part of the journey and the most risky part of the journey actually takes place within of India. There's 1,100 kilometers being transversed across India. Getting that container on board a train out of the New Delhi area is step number one. Getting it to the port is step number two. Getting it loaded onto the vessel is step number three. You're dependent on the railways. You're dependent on customs. You're dependent on people not demonstrating, people not occupying the tracks. All of these things, everything, the noisiness of our democracy goes and impacts the supply chain. In the summer months, when everybody goes on holidays and there's a huge need for rail travel, Indian Railways literally runs out of locomotives. So Concor, which is a big partner for us, has to mitigate that risk by saying, do I have sufficient locomotives to go and pick up that rake? Otherwise, that whole rake is sitting there with finished goods and is not moving. So those are, I think a lot of our risk actually tends to sit within of Indian borders before it even gets on the vessel.
Okay, it's my turn now to pose the same question to you.
Manvi, I would like to take the case of a telecom service provider whom we service in India.
Yeah.
So they basically manage the communication equipments on the towers and the systems for telecom companies. And we manage the spare management for the entire leg from the warehouse to the towers, and from the towers back to the factory in the US, getting it repaired, getting it back to the warehouse in India. Now, a huge leg, you don't know where the next breakdown is going to happen. So you need to plan to be able to get in the shortest possible time to the remotest of locations in India. A lot of them are not serviced by any of the major service providers. So you need to start identifying partners whom you can collaborate with, whom you can imbibe into the disciplines and the processes you need to have. And after imbibing them, to still plan for calamities happening. A perfect example I would say is, normally what happens is, whenever there is a breakdown in the northeast, the entire team starts to shake. The toughest region to take, you find partners, but you have to drive down from a Guwahati into a Siliguri, into a lot of locations which are known for landslides, which are known for strikes, and which are having a lot of areas which are black areas where there's no communication happening en route. So you would have a landslide happen and the truck struck somewhere in between, but no information available because there's no communication happening over there. So how do you plan that in advance? Once you have put your process in place, how do you mitigate that once you know by moving something else in a different fashion?
We're going to take a very quick break. We've collected a whole bunch of individual experiences from our four panelists. Now we'll try and put it together into a broad philosophy for risk management in supply chain operations. That's in a moment from now. A typhoon in Malaysia, a hurricane in the United States of America, a tsunami in coastal India, an earthquake in Uttarakhand. These types of supply disruptions, supply chain disruptions are increasing, and so is the effect that they're having on business performance. I'm going to ask, Mr. Jain, you this question first. Today, in this system of I have a supplier, my supplier has a supplier, something that you were referring to just a short while ago. Is it possible to have a direct line of sight to actually, have risk mapped down, not just at your company's level, but through that supply chain?
No, I believe you are absolutely right. I suppose there are areas how we can build a more resilient supply chain. The first I feel is that first step in the organization is we have to have a common risk assessment and there has to be a cross-functional multi-stakeholder engagement by which we can have a collective recognition of the risks which can throw our supply chain out of gear. The second is we have to do some kind of a scenario planning. The business has to recognize that there will be certain disruptions, certain failures, because volatility is something which has become the most dominant emerging global trend, and we have to understand that how do we deal with. The third, I would say, is we need a very strong, trusted network of business partners. Now, whether in the government or with the suppliers, we need to understand with amongst ourselves that whom are we dealing with, and there will be certain trade-off which will be involved. But at the same time, we need to understand that there has to be an equitable partnership which we need to build with our people. So the value of partnership has never been so dominant as it has been in the past. So how we can increase that level of trust in the business, and I think with these things, I believe that there is a strong plan that an organization can have towards risk management.
Okay, Mr. Tiwari, collaboration. How do you work with your suppliers, minimize the risk together with them, and find that right balance between trying to understand and absorb their risks?
We've started working with some of our large customers in the petrochemical sector here in India who are exporting, who've started saying to us, can you help partner with me in my dealings with my final customer, who may be a large soft drinks manufacturer globally? That means we take on part of their commitment to their customer to say, my job isn't just done when it's on the water, but my job is done when it finally hits that particular person. The other thing that I'd like to bring to our attention is the fact that you can try and mitigate risk or minimize risk. You can never get rid of it completely by the manner in which you design your networks, and that's something Percy and I were talking about earlier. But can you actually make sure that you have fallback options? In a country like India, you can't prevent a demonstration, you can't predict a strike or prevent it, etc. But you can say, well, if I can't call Nhava Sheva, then the next port of call is Pipav, or the next port of call is Mundra. So something will happen, but I have a fallback plan in order to be able to deal with it. And that's what we try and do as much as we can.
Is that exactly what your approach is too, Percy?
I would fully agree with Sanjay on that. Unfortunately, I think the learning process for a lot of companies is still slow. A lot of companies do not integrate risk management with supply chain management planning. They still look at supply chain and more towards the cost side of it rather than balancing cost and efficiencies.
Yeah, the pressure seems so much to be on cost reduction that maybe they're not spending enough time evaluating the vulnerabilities with
I fully agree, but let's understand. There was a study conducted by the World Economic Forum some time back, and they came up with a finding that the impact of calamities impacting supply chain on the share prices is to the extent of an average of 7%, which is large. So it's not something which you can ignore today. Another further study conducted ascertained 75% of around 400 companies studied were impacted by natural calamities at least once in a year. So it's not something which is very remotely possibly going to happen. It's going to happen. You would be the next one. The question is, when it happens, how well are you planned for it?
Mr. Chaturvedi, I wanted to draw you in here because, like you said at the outset, yours is of what, 4-year-old company, so operations to an extent, still have potential to scale up. Yet you've got global linkages coming in, going out. This is an important area for you to figure out your plan. How far and deep do you go in examining those feeding into you and those that you are serving? Just how much of your time and energy as a company and you as an executive is going into that aspect of risk?
My belief is all the companies, I'm not talking about India, across the globe, if you look at it, risk management as a supply chain discipline, unfortunately, has not been practiced. We talk a lot. It is something that is like even it's not even an insurance policy. We will talk about working with partners. We will see, you cannot get away from the fact that cost is a very big element of supply chain. So things like just-in-time manufacturing, lean manufacturing, they do not, under any circumstances, what they have done is they have removed the cushion from the supply chain. And by doing that, we are walking on a very, very thin line. So a little bit of a risk catastrophe or a country going in recession or a factory shutting down in China will have a direct impact on us. So even though I would love for it to be a part of my supply chain, but unfortunately you can't do it.
See, I also believe, sometimes, it really happens on the characteristics of the supply chain. I have worked in the FMCG industry earlier for a long time, and it depends really how, people manage the risk over there. say sometimes what happens, if the supply chain has an ability to inventorize goods. Say for example, in case of the FMCG industry, you can actually inventorize goods at multiple points, right? At the manufacturing, at the depot, at the wholesaler, and even at the consumer. Even if somebody buys a bottle of Horlicks, he has the product with him for about a month or so. But let's say, for example, take our industry, publishing. Now, the publishing industry works with a zero inventory of finished goods. Now, the moment you say that, now that creates an enormous amount of stress in the back end line, in terms of the robustness of the materials, the machines, and the men, and everything over there. Now that suddenly, just becomes a very dominant part of it. So I just believe that sometimes, what you need to have again with the senior management internally is that there has to be an agreement between marketing risk and manufacturing risk. Because if somebody has an aspiration that, we do not want to have a single potential customer who will be underserved or unserved. I mean, it may be great, marketing aspiration, but I think imagine the kind of vulnerability and the stress it will create in the manufacturing. So I think organizations have to understand that how we can strike this balance between marketing risk and manufacturing risk.
So let me ask you this question. I'm gonna be the devil's advocate here.
Okay,
in any
before
of your
you do
organization that you see.
Okay, before you do that, I'm just going to interrupt you. We'll allow you to play devil's advocate after this very quick break. Stay with us. Let me try and propose a definition of a resilient supply chain. Well, it's one that can take a hard hit and continue to function. It's one that can perhaps bounce back from even very severe disruptions. It's a supply chain that basically reacts quickly to sidestep problems that could be emerging, problems that haven't yet become crisis. Have I put out a fair definition of a resilient supply chain? I ask because you can't mitigate, and we've been using the word mitigate quite often today, but you can have a supply chain that is resilient.
Yes.
Any other attributes of a resilient supply chain, Mr. Tiwari?
Yeah, resilient. I mean, my favorite book of the moment, this book called Anti-Fragile. So how do you make a supply chain that's not fragile? Basically, how do you make a supply chain that can indeed change course very, very quickly? Can you change suppliers quickly enough? Can you change ports of call quickly enough? Can you adapt costs quickly enough when you have external events like the depreciation of the rupee? I think those are some of the critical things that we need to manage. Resilience,
attributes of resilience in a supply chain. Let's try and draw up as exhaustive a list as possible.
I would look at it as what are the key drivers of a resilient supply chain. I would say 4 key drivers. One is visibility. How visible is your end-to-end supply chain to let you know the smallest of information at the right time so that you can act on time?
Okay.
The second part is agility. How agile is your supply chain to react when the information is available? Many a time the information is available, but the organization structure is not clearly defined. The definition between the corporate structure, the departmental structure, which allows the supply chain manager to take quick decisions based on the information he's received. So agility becomes the second key driver to it. The third is collaboration. How well are you collaborating with your suppliers, with your vendors, with your customers? Is the culture of collaboration and agility going right down to the last supplier? A lot of it depends upon the culture you build between the entire value chain that you can react fast. And the fourth most important is control. Do you have control over the processes, over the information flow, over the handlings to be able to be resilient to eventualities?
Okay, you've described the ideal, Mr. Chaturvedi. I want to come to you for what's the real. Ideal attributes for a resilient supply chain. I think we've drawn up a pretty comprehensive list. The reality in India that you've encountered.
The Indian way of responding to risk in supply chain has a word to it, and we all know that. It's called jugaad. All right, at least in the startup environment, that's what we call it. The reality is that the way to manage the risk for Indian companies, I believe, is to prioritize. Identify the top 20 partners that do 80% of the business. Build a very strong risk management strategy sitting together collaboratively. And I think that will weather all the storms that you're going to get. If you're going to go boil the ocean, you're talking about being real, I'm being real. If you want to talk about boil the ocean and look at all the suppliers, all the business partners, build a risk management strategy, a risk mitigation plan, and so on and so forth, it's going to fail. Because you would have created a bureaucratic line, a bureaucratic level of people who would not know what their KRAs are. And when a hurricane hits, all of them will be under their desk. So identify the top 20%, people who do 80% of your business, put a very clear 2 or 3 things that need to be done, and you will have a great supply chain which will be risk averse. That would be my feedback.
Mr. Jain, what would be your feedback? Closing comments from each one of you.
See, volatility is somewhere just the opposite of resilience, and today volatility, whether it is volatility in the